Welcome to HortTube. My name is Jim Putnam. This is the garden question and answer video that I do pretty much every Sunday. You can ask gardening questions down in the comment section below the video, and that's where your question resides. I pick between 20 and 30 every week, and there are way more questions than that. So thank you guys so much for participating in this video, because without you, there's not a subscriber question and answer video each week. But again, there's so many questions that I couldn't possibly get to them all. I try to get ones, at least a few that are relevant to whatever time of year it is and whatever's going on. Holly's right down here below me, walking around, examining the big giant pile of wood chips that I have behind me. I got on a chip drop the other day. I had asked a guy that was cutting some trees up a week or so ago to come and drop them after he was done, and I didn't end up getting those. So I got on the chip drop site, and literally 45 minutes to an hour later, the guy was calling me. This is probably more than I need. I'm gonna do the paths in the back garden and behind the back fence area, and a few other spaces we'll do with wood chips. New planting areas along the front foundation and the back corner that I'll put down some wood chips initially. And then hopefully I'll have a neighbor come and grab some for his garden paths at his house, because it's a big giant pile. And then we're gonna get some more decorative hardwood mulch for the rest of the beds as soon as this pile is done. But this is gonna take a few days of work for sure. Let's see, the Learn to Garden video series is getting a video on gardening for your area this next week. So it's just gonna be, you know, whether you're gardening in the west or the east, have rain, don't have rain, have seasonal rain, extreme temperatures, all those kinds of things, and how, you know, that affects gardening. So I think that'll be a pretty good addition to the Learn to Garden video series. There's a discount code down below this video if you're interested in purchasing the Learn to Garden video series, and thank you to everyone who has. There was as you're watching this, you should have seen a neighborhood tour video, walk around video with some things that are flowering around the area. A tree pruning video went up earlier in the week, and a fertilizing video went up earlier in the week. And again, lots of content this upcoming week for the, we got a lot going on here in the garden in Raleigh, North Carolina. Let's see. And again, I'm sorry I can't get to every question. I mean, there's just so many, and especially as we're coming out of winter, you can see the uptick in questions on the question and answer video, where you have 120 comments one week and then 150. You know, the next week it's like, oh, we're launching up here out. You know, for a few warm days here and there, get people really going. Same thing on emails. It always makes me feel a little bad. I can't return all the emails that I get, because, you know, a lot of them have kind comments and things like that. But it would be my full-time job to return emails if that's what I was doing. So thank you very much for reaching out, but it's very difficult to return all of your kind emails and questions that you ask in emails as well. So again, sorry about that, but you know, it's just it's a lot of people reaching out. And again, I'm super appreciative on one hand, but I can't really respond to them, you know, on the other, unfortunately. Let's see, to all of them. All right, so let's get to some questions though, because this is one thing I can do, is answer these questions on Sunday, and hopefully it helps some folks out. So somebody asked why should they use compost or mulch to top dress their beds over wood chips they put down 2 years ago, and then should they opt for pine bark or hardwood mulch, and why not just pick compost, since mulch breaks down into compost? Well, you can absolutely pick compost as your mulch. There's no problem with that, and we kind of do that in spaces where we know we're going to be planting annuals, and so that can be my vegetable garden, you know, seasonal crops. That can be places where I'm putting pansies, you know, summer flowering things. I can use compost in those spaces, and it tends to be, I get a lot more out of the plants I'm putting into that space, because we have such a short season. We're asking a lot of a tomato plant or a pepper plant or an okra plant or a pansy or, you know, plant, or, you know, whatever else we're growing seasonally, right, in our gardens. We're asking a lot of them, and so that's why I use compost in those spaces, just to really get a lot out of them. And then in the rest of the beds, I tend to use hardwood mulch, because it breaks down a little slower. You know, you know, if you're using compost, number one, it's probably going to move around in the beds. Two, any walking through the beds you do, you're probably going to be tracking that around on your feet everywhere. You know, you have dirt. It's just a dirtier experience in the garden, and it's probably going to be more expensive. And one other concern that I have is on compost is where did it come from? You know, you know, what's in it? Did it have chemicals potentially in it from a crop or something like that? You know, so I somewhat am always a little nervous about toxic compost potentially bringing in chemicals that I didn't mean to end with compost. Whereas with the hardwood bark, most of that stuff is a forest product. You know, it probably is unlikely that it came out of a place that got a lot of chemical applications and stuff. It was lumber that was harvested in all likelihood, or trees that were harvested to produce lumber and that kind of thing. And then the bark off the trees with a little bit of wood is what we're buying. It's unlikely to have as many weed seeds potentially and any kind of toxic issues. And so, you know, some part of me is always slightly concerned, you know, not crazy concerned, you know, about it, but I like to use the mulch because it breaks down a little slower in the beds. These shrubs don't need all that really enriched, you know, kick to them anyway, whereas the annual plants that I'm planting do. So I'm using both. And okay, and then the first part of the question, I didn't finish the question one, sorry, I'm definitely yammering. Can you put whatever compost or hardwood mulch you're using, or pine bark or whatever it is, over wood chips that are 2 years old? Yeah, absolutely. That's probably plenty of time, as long as you're in an area where you've gotten some normal rainfall during that time. That should be plenty of time. You'll probably grab a handful of those broken down wood chips and see a little bit of wood in it, probably still remaining, but not much. You can absolutely mulch over top of that without any problem. My paths in the back garden only last about maybe 8 to 9 months. I could probably mulch over them at that point. But again, we're getting some rainfall here, which is helping with the process of breaking these wood chips down. If you're in a really dry area of the country, it may take a little longer for them to break down enough where I'd be throwing hardwood mulch or some other material over, burying it further down in the ground. Okay, let's see. Okay, so and then, okay, next question, similar but different. Why not use mulch instead of compost when planting? So one thing here in our clay soils is if we bury, I mean, this is literally chipped up limbs, trees, you know, all kinds of material from various shrubs, trees, limbs, you know, whatever, from probably limbs in this neighborhood that were cut off of over power lines and things like that. That are chipped up in this pile. This wood is very different than the bark of a tree. You think about the bark of a tree is meant to kind of protect that tree from breaking down. It's like the skin of the tree, and it breaks down a little bit slower than other things. This cellulose that's in the middle of the plant actually breaks down pretty quickly once the soil microbes start working on it. But I cannot bury this material down in 8 or 10 inches of our clay soil here in Raleigh, because the water, without oxygen, this will potentially become anaerobic. Like if I buried this 8 or 10 inches down in the soil here and then it rained for some period of time, when I re-dig that hole out, the hole will smell kind of funky. You know, have a really strange odor to it, and it's just anaerobic conditions. So I like to keep this wood material and most of the bark material above the ground. Pine bark is definitely buriable, and that's what most of the plants you're buying are actually grown in is a pine bark product. But the hardwood bark products and the hardwood or softwood wood material, like these wood chips, the actual wood, the middle of the tree or the middle of the limb, that material, we want to keep it above the ground and just lay it on the top of and that's how nature would work, right? A limb would drop off a tree and then it would break down slowly and become compost over some period of time. It wouldn't drop off the tree into a giant hole and then be buried with other stuff. It doesn't always become anaerobic, but certainly places where you get a lot of rainfall and your soil doesn't drain readily, burying wood under the ground is not a good idea. So compost is compost or pine bark are okay to mix in when you're planting, and burying something 8-10 inches underground where there's no light and there's no air, or not a lot of air, so that things break down properly. If you use wood material and you bury it down that far, some of you have soils that will become anaerobic from that. So that's enough. Okay. Somebody asked about the update on the irrigation here, and then how to add dirt mulch over their irrigation lines. So when we put in these beds, I ran drip irrigation lines through them. So all of these beds in this garden, if you pull back the mulch, about every 12 inches or so, there's bands of irrigation line. I have never hooked it in. We haven't gone into any kind of serious drought conditions, luckily, since I started this project. And so probably the most we've gone is maybe a month without rain. And even then I didn't have to do a whole lot of watering. So I've just not hooked it in or gotten it set up. So that's where mine is, but it's here, and I know where the ends are, where I can just connect it into my faucets. That way is how I'll end up hooking it in when I need it. Because at some point, we had a drought here like 2007 that lingered for about 6 months. I mean, our lakes were in severe, conditions. They were counting days of water we had remaining. So at some point, hopefully though, the garden will be established enough that even then I wouldn't need a whole lot of extra water, but that would be the point that I would hook it in. Anyway, they were asking, so you lay those lines out all over the place, and then should you cover them in dirt? I just covered them in mulch. And the first time you mulch, so number one, I use sod staples, which are little metal staples that you can buy. They're literally called sod staples. You can just search for them on Amazon or go to a garden center and buy them, whatever. I use sod staples to hold the line down here and there. So to make sure that line is kind of flat with the ground without pushing them so hard that I'm pinched the irrigation line. But I put the sod staples in to make sure it's flat to the ground, and then we mulched over the top of that. The first time you mulch the garden after you've put down irrigation, you're probably gonna have spots here and there over a few months where you're gonna see the line. But by the time you've mulched a second time or a third time or a fourth time, you'll find that you don't see it anymore. So I have to hunt for it now out here. There might be a spot or two somewhere that I could see this morning if I really went hunting for it. But you'll notice that over time, just mulch over the top of it. I wouldn't bury it in soil, that drip irrigation line. There you go. Let's see. So somebody wants hellebores in zone 7 in New Jersey. They get morning sun and afternoon shade. Is that okay? Yes, that's ideal. So you can get some morning sun on your hellebores. Some direct sun is fine, just not that middle of the afternoon full sun. Although as you get further and further and further north, a shade plant for me becomes more and more tolerant of the summers that you would have further and further north. So if you're in zone 5 in upper Michigan somewhere, you can probably put them in more and more and more sun. But certainly zone 7, New Jersey, morning sun, afternoon shade is kind of perfect for Lenten roses or hellebores. Number 5, somebody's in Arkansas, zone 8A. They get an Arctic blast or a hard freeze every year that seems to do some damage to the plants that they have, and they're using zone 6 plants. Are they correct to avoid zone 8 plants? This is kind of interesting. I mean, there's, somehow this new USDA map zone, the USDA Hardiness zone map comes out, and all of a sudden you have zone 8A in Arkansas, because the last data set. This is the USDA's horticultural zone map is made up of 2 15-year data sets. So it goes back basically 30 years. Because the idea is that every 15 years, you'll have a really low temperature, and every 15 years, you'll have a really high temperature. And then going with 2 of those 15-year data sets, we'll have 2 really cold lows and 2 really hot summers. And that way, we get a balancing out. But the data set, it's 12 years since it was updated last time, but in the second 15-year data set, it was so much warmer everywhere that everybody's been put into, I think it was more than half the country moved up at least a half a zone. So having zone 8A Arkansas. But see, the problem with the zone map is it doesn't tell you what was your coldest temperature during that 30-year data set, right? That's the problem with the zone map, is that it says I'm in zone 8A, but that's an average over 30 years. So obviously we're warming, right? And especially our nighttime temperatures have, warmed quite a bit over that period of time. But that doesn't mean that you didn't get a zone 7A temperature during that 2 15-year data sets. And so that's the issue. We wish that they would put what was the actual cold temperature that occurred during this last set of data, because that would be super helpful, because people who want to avoid any issues would know what that temperature is. So if I can say I'm in zone 8A in Raleigh, but maybe I had 0 degrees one night during that data set. Well, I want to plant plants that are hardy down to 0, because I'm risk averse. I don't want to spend money and have it, what good is knowing you're in zone 8A Arkansas if every 15 years half your plants die? Well, it's kind of a worthless map at that point. So yes, over in 2 things you have going over there. So you're zone 8A Arkansas, I'm zone 8A Raleigh, North Carolina. Between me and you, we have the Appalachian Mountains, and those mountains tend to moderate wind for us. They tend to moderate the ups and downs. So something can come across the country and just be so nasty across the Midwest and down into places like Arkansas, Missouri, and then by the time they hit, and then into Tennessee, and those in Tennessee can tell you how much leafy evergreen damage they've had over the last few years. And then it goes across the mountains and it moderates quite a bit for us. So we may get down to the same temperature you got down to, but we don't get there quite in the same violent manner that happened in Arkansas or Missouri or Tennessee. So it doesn't drop. It's not 80 one day and 12 the next. It tends to be just more moderate drops and falls and rains and those kinds of things on my side. And so our leafy evergreens survive much better here than they do on the other side of the mountains, for sure. And if you go hunting through the woods in Arkansas, this time of year, you're going to see very few evergreen plants just naturally out in the woodlands. There's not a lot of leafy evergreen things. So I don't know if it's a zone that I would pick things just for zone 6. I would think about not having leafy evergreen things out in open spaces where that wind can be an issue. I think if you're growing leafy evergreen things that are only zone 7 hardy or zone 8A hardy, those things need to be protected around the envelope of a foundation or behind a fence or something like that. And then the things that are out in more open space, that are more exposed to the fact that you're going to do more of this than I am, that's where you're going to really think about using zone 6 things that can hold up in those kinds of winds. I think I've been overly talkative in this one. Somebody said, why did I get rid of the greenhouse that was over in the corner? So there was initially a metal frame building in that corner when we started this project, and then I built the wooden shed on the other side and painted it, knowing that the house was going to end up the same color as the shed. And then I was going to I took the metal off that metal building, and I was going to skin it and turn it into a greenhouse. I've had the cover over the top of it, and I've had irrigation in there to do some propagation and that kind of thing. But we just got looking at it over time and thought that I'd rather plant something in that corner that looks better. And if I need a greenhouse, I will build some sort of small hoop house like I had at the old house. If you've been following along long enough, I'm pretty handy at building greenhouses out of lots and lots of different kinds of materials, because I had to build lots of greenhouses on the cheap, when I was a young nurseryman. So I pretty much anything I can scrap together. I've got a pipe bender. I did definitely showed it on the channel back in some propagation videos, how I take the top rail from the chain link fence and turn it into little greenhouses and hoop houses and that kind of thing. So I had that. It's a pretty inexpensive tool, really, that you can create little small hoop houses and greenhouses and that kind of thing. So I just don't think I need that size greenhouse. I've had no use for it since we've been here. I tend to use the back porch or just simply cover things, with some sort of shade cloth or frost protection blanket during the winter time. So it just opened up a whole new planting space in that back corner that I think ultimately will look better in the background of the videos as well, because this has been a problem since we've been here. Is we've had so many projects going on in every angle that, you know, some of the backgrounds just aren't great overall. So just trying to get every corner to be where I can walk out with the camera and feel confident that everything looks good in every direction I point this camera is the ultimate goal for this spring. Somebody asked how to best save plants before a landscape construction project. So they've watched a video on me doing root pruning on plants so that you can more easily dig them out later, and maybe they will have reformed a few roots back in the middle by the time you transplant them. So there's just literally cut the roots in a circle around the plant, leave it there for a few months, and then dig it out. They wanted to know if they should put the trees and shrubs in grow bags or how they should do it. So the way, when I used to they have construction, they're putting in a pond and several other things. That's why they need to pull plants out, hold them for a while, have this construction done, and then they're going to reuse these plants back in the space. The way we did this on landscape jobs, I had to do this all the time. We'd pull plants out, do some sort of major landscape construction, build retaining walls, whatever we were doing, and then reuse some of those plants. I actually healed them in pine bark. If there's pine bark soil conditioner or some sort of compost and pine bark material. I've got a woodpecker over here on a light pole. I don't know if you guys can hear it. It's kind of funny. We actually just healed them in. We would take all the plants out of the ground, put them together, you know, basically root ball to root ball to root ball, and then take some pine bark and spread through it to fill it in. And so I just call them, you know, healing it in place, or healing them all together so that they're all in one big mass, and then some sort of bark material to cover the root balls a little bit. So it's like planting them on top of the ground basically temporarily. You can put everything in grow bags, but then they end up individually, and I got a question coming up about grow bags actually. You end up putting them all in their own jeopardy. Right, so if you miswater one, if you overwater one, what material are you going to use to fill those grow bags? You know, most of these shrubs don't need a whole lot of water. I mean, they need some water, but they want to stay moist, but they don't want to be wet. So I'd be careful putting them in individual bags, because every single one is in a separate risk group, you know, when you do that. And if you know, it's much easier to make mistakes when they're all individuals like that. Whereas if I put them in one big mass and then put bark over them, I can just monitor them as a group, water them as a group, all the same. So when it dries out, I'll water it really thoroughly, and then I'll walk away for a while. When they're individual pots, you'll probably find that one pot needs to be watered every day, and one pot is not needed water since I did it, and that kind of thing. So for me, I would heal them all together. Man, I can talk, can I? Let's see. So how do you consider a newly planted tree or shrub established? This is such a great question, because it's such a strange thing. It's like some sort of thing. If I can just get it to the point where it's established, I never have to think about it again. Or, you know, for most things in the garden, I would say that if you plant something, a full growing season, in a well-prepped soil that is well mulched, I would consider it established when you no longer would be panicked about going to the beach for a week or two, that kind of thing. But that doesn't mean that something is not going to continue to need something from you at some point. But things take much longer to become established around existing tree roots. So there's a difference in time between some things. Some things, it's amazing to me, some things will just hit the ground and just be rooted in and growing, and you just kind of never have to think about them again. And then some things will just fight you for 2 or 3 years before they are not wilting in the afternoon and demanding something extra from you. So it definitely varies. It probably varies by soil type, probably varies by the summer temperatures you have in that first summer. It probably depends on whether the plant took a setback in the planting process. You know, did it hit the ground and just start rooting in and growing and has never missed a beat? Or did it go through some sort of weird transplant shock? Because that could extend the time that would take, you know, to kind of be on its own. That back shade line we have back there is just a tough spot. When we plant something, it takes 2 years for them to get rooted in enough that I can not have to think about them all the, you know, every single time I have a water hose in my hand. But the things out here in the front garden where this soil had the wood chips and the compost, and there was an old, you know, that was under grass for 80 years, and that grass actually had improved the soil as well, believe it or not, over some long period of time. Every time you mow the grass, that material is improving the soil. These things hit the ground and have hardly needed any irrigation at all. So there is no good answer for this. That's the answer is there's no good answer, and I think everybody's going to fight this differently depending on whether they have sandy soils, clay soils, hot summers, dry summers. The plants are pretty good. A lot of the leafy evergreens especially are pretty good at wilting and telling you, you know, that they're under some sort of stress, for sure. But there's no great answer for this. Watering is the part of gardening that really can't be taught very well. You know, I would say this in the Learn to Garden video series. I can teach you plants that will grow in your area. I can teach you how to put them in the ground. I can teach you how to reduce your weeds population a little bit over time. All kinds of gardening techniques, pruning, fertilizing, everything. Really, really difficult to teach someone how to water their plants properly. It's something where you know, killing a few, abusing a few, overwatering a few over that time, and it's, you know, figuring out your back garden that stays abnormally wet during certain times of the year versus your front garden that stays slightly moist a different time of year. So there's all kinds of things. The way the builder, what soils the builder slammed back up against your foundation after they finished the project. You know, that foundation bed may be much harder to establish plants in than other areas out in the garden, just because it's literally a different soil they brought in or something like that. So I don't have a great answer for when plants established, but you'll know it. Once you've done this for a while, you'll look back and think about some viburnum that, man, I watered that thing like crazy the first year, and I haven't thought about it in 6 months. And you'll start to, you know, recognize it that way. So somebody asked if they can underplant a Japanese maple. Is that okay? Yeah, for sure. You can definitely put ground cover plants around your Japanese maple. And if your Japanese maple's out in a ton of sun, it probably would appreciate it to not have the sun, you know, beating down on the roots of the plant. If you think about where most every shrub and tree and ground cover in the world has its roots shaded by some surrounding plant. You know, not true necessarily of grasses. Even grasses. I mean, grasses don't get mowed in the wild, so even they are shading themselves and they're shading their neighbors, right? When you see almonds being grown out in California, each of those almond trees is shading its neighbor's roots, keeping the sun from, you know, really hitting the ground in a very hot and sunny place in California. And it's the same thing out here. So really, almost every plant in your garden would appreciate definitely mulch at a minimum, and then other annuals, perennials, ground covers potentially being planted under them. They live in that kind of symbiosis together, shading each other's roots. Even plants that like full sun, you know, you'll typically see out on the edge of the woods. You know, like I want the top in the full sun, but I don't necessarily want my roots in the full sun. Okay. So somebody asked about plants, planting plants around a pool. They didn't give any kind of zone information, so I can't really answer what plants I would use. They were asking about roots being an issue in the long run, and certainly I wouldn't plant, you know, weeping willows. They're kind of trash trees regardless. I wouldn't put one next to a pool, but you know, I'm not going to plant things that are notorious for bad roots, river birches and red maples and weeping willows. None of those would be a good idea anyway, because they're also trash trees that drop extra stuff. Like red maples drop those little seed pods, you know, they drop their flowers, then their seed pods, and then their leaves in the fall, and they'd shade your pool, and you wouldn't have, you know, your pool would be cold much longer every year. So a lot of reasons I wouldn't use a red maple, but just saying that the roots would be problematic. So nothing that's notorious. I think most shrubs are going to be fine, probably unlikely to hurt your pool or your foundation around your house. but it's plants that are kind of that drop things all the time. That's your main enemy around a swimming pool. Definitely down in Florida, I did a consultation with someone the other day who has got a beautiful swimming pool in their back garden, and he's got a lot of palms, obviously, because and palms are pretty good about not being super trashy. And that's the kind of plants we were just consulting about, was like what plants are not shedding all the time. So that's something to think about. And I'd probably, again, not knowing your zone, when you go to the garden center, tell them that's your main concerns and see what they have in mind. There are lots of evergreen plants that actually shed kind of nonstop. Azaleas are one of those. Azaleas are just kind of constantly in the process of actually shedding leaves. But my Clayera that I have over here, if you're in a warm enough area, would be a great option. They shed a few leaves over the course of the year, but for the most part, very, very few. So you want leafy, I think, around a swimming pool, evergreen things as much as possible so they're not dropping tons of leaves in your pool. And then leafy evergreens that hopefully don't shed constantly, because some things that we call evergreen just literally are dropping stuff all the time. There were several tree pruning questions this week. The tree pruning video went up Thursday, I guess, and it's probably want to take a look at that on some of the pruning questions. And I've been doing so many pruning videos, but I will continue in the future to make pruning videos. Some of the questions get so detailed about where should I prune it along, whatever. It's really hard to answer that in this question and answer, but you can look at some of the pruning videos that I've done over the last 3 years in February and March. And there's a playlist on the channel for pruning that may be helpful for that. But you're in charge of most of these trees, and how they're going to look in the future if you're buying them small enough. You really are in a lot of control over them. And you might want to look at some of the tree forming videos that I've done, tree forming the shrubs out here, because I know they're not trees, but they will give you some insight into how much control, how much real control you can have over, over a tree or a shrub over the long run, and where you cut and how you cut things. Let's see, where did I get cuttings when I had my nursery? That's a good question. I had all kinds of little spaces where I would go and get cuttings of things that were difficult to come up with a lot of cuttings. So as an example, camellias only root on like the first 4 leaves as they harden off in the spring. So the camellia flushes, it blooms, like maybe your Camellia japonica is blooming right now. Then it will flush out, and camellias don't grow a whole lot in a season, but as that new flush of growth starts to harden off, maybe June 15th-ish or so for us, about 4 leaves back, that's where that thing will root. Almost nothing else on that plant will root. So if you have a nursery and you only have a few camellias and you're trying to build up numbers on them, it was very, very hard. So I had spots around where I would go and take cuttings from. I'd ask neighbors for cuttings. I had a spot, I grew a lot of Firepower Nandina cuttings for other nurseries. It's a non-invasive Nandina. It turns red in the wintertime. People are very familiar with it here in the South. This time of year, they're like giant red, little 3-foot red balls this time of year that stand out from a mile away. But that's another plant that very few cuttings, only the terminal growth on the end of the top of a branch. And you look at it and go, wow, that's a lot of cuttings on that plant. And then you get in there and realize it's only like 7 branches coming up. That was only 7 cuttings. So I could only take that one plant and produce 7. Whereas on something like a holly, I could produce hundreds out of one plant. So I had a little spot that I would go and cut them back in the city of Clayton every year. I did their pruning for them in this bed in the middle of literally in the middle of a road. I would go park my pickup, walk over there with a bag and cut them back. And they looked great because I was cutting them every winter. And I guess I looked like a town employee. That was kind of interesting. So I had all kinds of ways in which I would get cuttings. My preferred method, and I think you have the most success with, is taking cuttings off of healthy, vigorous, young plants in your own nursery. So once you get, let's say you've started a bunch of sky pencil hollies, and it's something you're going to be growing and you want to get cuttings, The best cuttings you're ever going to take are off juvenile plants in your own nursery that are growing vigorously. The old sky pencil holly in the ground, the percentage of plants the cuttings that will root drops off dramatically the more a plant ages. So that can be problematic. But juvenile growth roots the best. So once you start to build up your own numbers and you just get a few things rooted here or there, those young plants that you're cutting on a lot will yield the best cuttings. Okay, so somebody has lilac and Rosa Sharon volunteers and they want to transplant them to a new location. Is now the time? Yeah, definitely while they're dormant. And if you go back to the shrub pruning video for deciduous shrubs from last week, on my Caryopteris over there, I showed a root sucker that I just simply pulled out of the ground by hand, cut it away from the parent plant, and then I actually root pruned it and then pruned the top of it, and that thing could have just been planted right back in the ground immediately. But both, be careful with Rose of Sharon volunteers because they are, the older varieties of Rose of Sharon are definitely invasive. There are new ones that are seed free. So I gotta be careful with that. You know, when we're talking about, again, that Nandina I just mentioned. It's a non-invasive Nandina, but Nandina domestica is considered invasive. So a lot of the plants we consider invasive now have sterile cultivars out there in the world. And so about the time everybody discovered that it's bad to have invasive plants, nurserymen and plant breeders were steady fixing it all this time. And we actually have ways to continue to use these great ornamental plants without them being an issue for our native plants. And I look back here and say native plants, and that's a giant Chinese privet on the city's property right there. Not a native plant. Let's see. I guess it's native now. We couldn't get rid of all the Chinese privet if we wanted to. Another controversial opinion by Jim. So somebody has unequal growth on mirrored plants on their foundation. Can they prune one side and fertilize the other to help catch it up? I would not over push plants with fertilizer. I've talked about this. If you push them too hard, you're likely to set them up and make them vulnerable to other problems. So I would be careful doing that. And then you definitely can prune the one side to slow it down to allow the other side to catch up. But most foundation plantings don't need to be equal like that. So maybe it's an opportunity to also stand back and say, hey, these haven't been my favorites on this side since the beginning, and maybe we could switch them out for something else that would be better in that slightly shadier side or that slightly wetter side or whatever the difference is. I don't know, because foundations can be that way. Even though one side of the house faces the same direction, you can get one side of it that gets a little shade, little pocket in it every day that the other side doesn't, and it creates different, or wetter or drier, all kinds of things. But it creates different situations. But they don't have to be mirrored. So that's another thing too. You can tell yourself that it's okay if you take one side out or a few things out on the one side that aren't making you happy and replace them with something else that might be better for those conditions. There are very few really formal houses, where they're where they truly have a centered porch and, they're the same on both sides of the house or need to have formal plantings on each side of the porch. Maybe yours is, but I don't know. So somebody said their loropetalum was damaged by young deer. Will it recover? This is the thing about, this deer resistance thing. I put up the hellebore video and I made the mistake once again of saying something was deer resistant, and somebody said down below their deer were eating their hellebores. So sometimes it can be young deer and they're just trying out the things that they want to eat, but it can be death by 1,000 cuts, especially if you've put down, it's a new, smaller plant, right? Doesn't take many bites of sampling it for that deer to go, I don't really like it, but I damaged it big time. Your loropetalum will likely recover if they're still pliable, bendable. Leave it alone. When something gets damaged like this is when people will start paying attention to something too much and start thinking about watering it or pushing it too hard with fertilizer. The plant's under stress. Walk away. Let it heal on its own a bit. Don't step in and try to think you can fix it, because that's when you'll kill it, is when it's under stress. That's when you'll love it to death. But this deer thing is just so crazy. I mean, there's nothing that I could say that's considered deer resistant, even the most deer resistant plants. There's always going to be somebody now down below. There's just so many deer everywhere that somebody has a deer that will eat it. You know, and it's really more about probably testing things in your garden rather than going all in on them. I've said this a bunch. You know, if you have deer issues, even if that thing is supposed to be deer resistant, I would not go buy 7 of them, especially with the prices of plants now. I go buy 1 of them, see what happens with it for a little while, and then go all in on them, because your deer might not eat it where somebody else's will or won't, or they will. I don't know. Okay, let's see. Somebody has new construction. Okay, all right. All right, somebody was just asking general questions about creating new beds and things, and they're adding mulch to beds and planting trees and doing all kinds of things. It was a very long thing. They asked if they were on the right path, and I would say yes to, you know, all the things they had written. But they had one concerning thing in the question: was their builder had cleared out the entire lot, but they had left one 80-foot tall pine. I would be careful with that pine, and this is just from personal experience. I talked about that ponderosa pine in California that was on a lean a week or 2 ago, and I said they should get an arborist to come and take a look at it. Here in the South, these trees, when they grow in the woods and they're close to one another, and I've said this a few times before, when they're close to one another, they're in a race for sunlight. They're shading their own roots, and they're cooperating in some ways, but in other ways they're trying to make sure I'm the king of the sun. And so they're racing one another, and they don't produce really rigid wood that can stand up under heavy winds. So my experience here at the old house, I closed on that house about 3 weeks before Hurricane Fran, and the builder had cleared out a big section of a very wooded, my neighborhood was called Pleasant Woods. Post-Hurricane Fran, people called it Pleasant Stumps. Well, I lost 120 some trees on that lot that were 4-inch caliper or bigger, you know, up to very, very large trees. And most of the trees that fell were, all the trees that fell were because they were exposed to wind that they would have never been exposed to. If that had just been a wooded space and all those houses had not been put in, the roads hadn't been cut in, those trees would have in all likelihood been fine. They would have just swayed with one another. Some would have come down, but the reason that they all came down, in some of the neighborhoods I worked in a neighborhood called Preston and Cary quite a bit after Hurricane Fran. It was another neighborhood that had been cleared out for a golf course and other things, but they had left these just individual pines here and there. They're not sturdy. Pines that grow out in open space and they're exposed to the wind are super sturdy, and I'm not scared of them in any way. Ones that were grown in the woods and then were cleared out around them, I'm worried about the construction around the roots. Did they damage the roots? So I'm just throwing that out there. If that tree is aimed at my house, it'd be gone, and I would replant the tree. You know, I love, you know, you all know how much I love plants, but I will definitely take a tree out that's a threat to the house. Anyway, so somebody wants to increase the size of a bed, and they need to raise it 6 to 12 inches. What material should they use? They had access to composted topsoil. You know, I've talked about topsoil. I just don't want to bring a lot of that stuff into my garden. I'd rather maybe raise it up by initially putting in some wood chips and letting those break down some. Maybe some sort of planting mix that has some sort of bark product that may be a nursery mix of some kind that I might raise it up a little bit with. If you can find existing soil on your own property, and that way you don't create other problems. Keep in mind, if you bring in whatever this topsoil is, we don't know where it came from. We don't know what chemicals, maybe it's from a farm field, we don't know what chemicals it are. It may create a soil profile. So when you dig into your soil and you look at it like a cake, you know, the layers of a cake, those are horizons down there. So it might start out with a little bit of humus on the top, and then it might be a little sandy layer. Then you might see some clay, maybe a rock layer. All those are horizons. adding additional horizons can sometimes cause issues, just in general, because the plants that you plant in it might love that fluffy new composted topsoil, and then the roots will hit that horizon below it, your existing soil, and the roots never penetrate that. They just go outward from there, and they really never become established deeper down in your existing soil. You're always better off improving your existing soil, is my point. And maybe you can find some material there on the property to raise it up. The other thing you could get from ordering topsoil is some sort of weed you don't currently have that becomes a noxious weed in your garden, or is some sort of chemical that comes along with it, or whatever. I would avoid it if you could. I think this is number 19 this week. Does bagged fertilizer expire? They bought a granular fertilizer a few years ago and haven't used it yet. Yeah, I would be careful, just depending on also how it was stored. So fertilizer can obviously melt, in the bag a bit, and then, so let's say you bought a slow release fertilizer and then it got hot wherever it was. That plastic encapsulation of that fertilizer could have broken down slightly. So now, instead of being a 3 to 4 month slow release, you throw that fertilizer out and it all releases at one time, really, really quickly. That could be an issue. What I would do if I had a bag of, let's say, lawn fertilizer or, whatever kind of fertilizer, I wouldn't throw it in the trash can. I don't want it to end up in, all those nutrients to end up, in our water somehow in the future. The best thing to do I would take a bag of, let's say I had a 20-pound bag or 10-pound bag of fertilizer that I thought was old and expired. This is me personally. I would take it and I would throw it out over a very, very, very large area, a much larger area than the bag calls for. So let's say it was a bag of fertilizer that was supposed to cover 5,000 square feet of turf. I'd throw it out over 30,000 square feet of turf and get rid of it that way. So the nutrients could still be used, the fertilizer could still be used, and then I would, if that is a synthetic fertilizer, I don't really know. Even an organic fertilizer, this is the way I would handle it. And then I put up the fertilizer video earlier in the week and explained why organic fertilizers are better. And in the future, just buy the fertilizer and go ahead and use it, so you don't have to think about this, obviously, going forward. But I would dispose of it by spreading it out far and wide, because I'm scared that the nitrogen that's in it would release very, very quickly all at once. But spread out over a giant area, it shouldn't have a negative impact on anything. If it's clumpy together, be careful not to throw a clump of it anywhere. That I probably would throw in the garbage, put it in a plastic bag and throw it in the garbage if it's clumped together. But if it's still spreadable, just spread it out far and wide. Okay, so somebody asked me what the weeping tree is behind me. That Golden Falls Redbud was in the pruning video this week, if you want to go back and learn about the Golden Falls Redbud. When to plant liatris directly into the ground in Charlotte. You could actually do it in Charlotte right now. Just it's coming out of winter while the soil temperature is still cool. And you plant them about 4 inches down, so there's no threat of that corm. They're actually, we say liatris bulbs because they look like a bulb, but it's technically a corm. They get planted about 4 inches down, and there's no way in Charlotte you're going to get a freeze that freezes the soil 4 inches down. If you do, we're in trouble here in Raleigh too. So you'd be fine, go ahead and put them in the ground at this point. I generally start them in containers and get a little bit of growth on them before I put them in the ground, but you don't have to do that. But I have jump starting videos the last couple years showing liatris as one of those things, but I could have actually gone ahead and put it in the ground. Anywhere liatris is hardy, which is probably zone 5 to 9, native, great native perennial, you can put it in the ground as soon as the ground is workable, and you don't think it would freeze down to that 4-inch depth at that point in your area. Even then, it probably wouldn't do that much damage. Keep in mind that your liatris corms, that first year they'll come up and they'll bloom a little bit. They won't be the greatest, but the second year they come back from those kinds of corms you buy from garden centers and box stores this time of year. They're small. Second year they come back, they'll be quite showy. And that's been my experience. When to prune lavender in Southwest Chicago. You definitely do it late winter before the new growth starts on them, is typically when you do it. here in the southeast where lavender doesn't perform quite as well, just take wide paths around your lavender and don't prune it. You know, that would be my suggestion. Although there are some lavenders like Phenomenal that's better for the southeast now. There has been a lot of plant breeding around lavender, but I watch other people's lavender pruning videos in the Pacific Northwest and other places, and you know, they're taking weed eaters to it and all kinds of stuff. But here in the southeast, they don't particularly like the humidity, they don't particularly like the clay soils. You know, if you have a lavender that's doing well, you know, I'm not gonna prune it at all probably. There were a few other tree pruning questions. One was about a tree that was, when they were going to prune a crossing branch in it, but it was going to leave a big gaping hole in the tree. Should they still do it anyway? Yes, definitely. Crossing branches, you know, are going to be a bigger problem in the future, you know, potentially leaving an open wound or something on the plant or causing it to break in some way or be weak in some way later. So if I had a crossing branch, even if it was going to leave a gap in it, I'd go ahead and take the crossing branch out that you think's the better one of the two to take out. And then you can do a little bit of top pruning on it in the future to create some additional branching down in it. We'll fill it out. Maybe just opening up that hole in the middle of the plant will get some light into it that will allow it to fill in anyway without having to do anything in the future. Oh wow, Steph wrote the questions down for me this week, and she wrote down a lot of them. Let's see. So somebody asked, is it okay to start seeds in an unheated building near Athens, Georgia? If we use a grow light, is it too cold? I don't know, potentially. It just depends on the weather outside. People will start stuff outside in the milk jugs, but that milk jug is like a little greenhouse. So it's heating up during the day. What seeds need is warm bottoms and, you know, and cold tops. So if you were going to start them in an unheated building, I would get a heating mat to put under the trays to keep the soil warm. Because you think about, that's where seeds are starting to germinate this time of year, whether it's weed seeds, desirable seeds, whatever they are, they're germinating as the soil temperature hits a certain temperature. If you read on the back of the soil pack, a good seed packet will tell you the soil temperature at which that seed will germinate. Some might say 65, some may say 80. Okay, it's got to be that warm for that seed to germinate. So in your unheated building, you may lower how fast or how many of the, you know, the seeds are going to germinate. They may germinate at slightly more different times, right? Because it's unheated. So if you're doing it in an unheated building, I'd put a heat pad underneath it. So there's, you know, if your light is heated, that would probably help as well. If your light actually produces heat, like LEDs don't produce heat, or very little heat. So an older light, a fluorescent light would produce some heat. That may be helpful. Okay. So somebody wants to do a rejuvenation pruning on 30-year-old blueberries down to 3 feet. Can they do that? Yes, you can, but it's going to be a long time before they recover and produce berries again. The way blueberries are typically pruned is the oldest canes are pruned down to the ground completely, and the rest of the plant is kind of left in place. The thing about blueberries is like caning plants. You know, you get suckers that come up from the ground. Those youngest suckers you won't get flowers on typically until the second season. And then that second, third, fourth, fifth season is when they do their most blooming and most producing of blueberries. And then those canes get kind of old and gnarly and they don't produce as much. So the way they're typically pruned is the oldest, maybe third, 25 to 30% of the canes are taken all the way to the ground. So that's the way I would prune your blueberries. If you do that rejuvenation pruning on them, the plant will be fine. The plant's not going to suffer, but your blueberry production will for a long period of time, because it takes a couple years for those new canes to really produce anything, sometimes 3 years. So somebody has and this question can just be for any tree or shrub. They have a Japanese pine that has one really heavy irregular branch on one side of it. Should they support it or cut it off? Definitely cut it off. Any limb that threatens the plant from either like an ice storm or a windstorm, rain, whatever, at some point, if it's threatening the entire plant, you're better off cutting it off. And if it's a heavy limb, that tree pruning video from this week, I showed how to prune off heavy limbs without damaging the tree. So somebody asked me my opinion on Rising Sun Redbud, which is the first of the gold redbuds. My weeping Golden Falls Redbud in the back garden back there is the weeping gold version of that. And there's several other yellow cultivars now. They're all really weak. I got a buddy up the street with a Rising Sun Redbud. He's had to do massive surgery on that thing a few times now. So keep in mind, while that plant's small, it grows too fast for its own good. I think that's a plant that needs to be pruned a little bit. Like when it puts on 4 feet of growth, I'm probably going to take a little bit of that growth off each season to make sure that the interior of that plant is strong enough to support it. So I'm not discouraging anyone from planting Rising Sun Redbuds. I'm just telling you, initially, I think you should do a little bit of size control on it to make sure the caliper of that tree is capable of holding up the top of that tree. That tree has been damaged yearly, and we haven't had an ice storm. We haven't had any kind of really, really heavy, like we haven't had a hurricane or nothing like that. That thing gets destroyed in gets damaged in minor events. And I think it's just because it went from nothing to 12 feet wide and 12 feet tall in like 2 seasons. And it created a very weak structure inside of it. So that's my thoughts on it. I'm not opposed to them. I love them. They're beautiful trees. And so is mine back here, but it's really weak wood. When I was cutting on that tree the other day, they were more breaking than cutting. I would start to cut it, and about the time the blade made any kind of start on cutting the branch, it just broke off. I was more breaking them than I was cutting them. It's kind of strange. So somebody asked my opinion on grow bags versus large nursery pots. So maybe they're starting potatoes or they're starting some sort of vegetables in grow bags. So large nursery pots, you want to, if you're going to use nursery pots to do any of your vegetables, you want to raise them up off the ground a bit. Those drain holes on the bottom, we want to make sure that they don't get buried down in the ground or in the mulch and the water is not able to get out of the containers. As long as you do that, I would actually prefer nursery pots over grow bags. As long as you create some air movement underneath them, make sure water can drain out of the drain holes easily. But we do use some grow bags for some potatoes and other things. One area I do like the grow bags is I can feel the potatoes forming on the side of them. The area that I don't like the grow bags is not only, typically in a nursery container, you're going to lose water through the drain holes in the bottom. The excess water will run out of the drain holes, and then the plant will use water, right? And then it will evaporate out of the top. So that's the 3 ways we're going to lose water out of that container. In the grow bag, you lose water from every possible angle. And man, by the time the potatoes root in, it's really hard to keep them watered. We're watering our potatoes almost twice a day by the time, as it gets closer and closer to harvesting them in June. So that's the downside but one nice thing about them is after I use them, I dry them out and I fold them up and they fit on a shelf and they store really, really easily. So there's positives and negatives. I think overall I'd rather use nursery pots as long as I'm elevating them off the ground to make sure the drain holes drain. Okay, this is gonna be the last question for this week. Man, there are a lot of good questions this past week, and probably 30 or 40 that we didn't write down. So thank you guys very much for that. Again, the Learn to Garden video series is continuing to be built out each month, and we are working on another project that I'll be talking about here in the next few weeks as well that I'm pretty excited about. Okay. So somebody asked if we will be mulching just directly over the leaves out here in the garden. This person left their leaves in place just like we did here in Raleigh, which again looks a little messy, but ultimately has kept the ground and the plants happier through the winter time, kept my weed population down, and kept the birds happy. The birds are back there flipping leaves over everywhere, hunting for all the things that hide in those leaves. And so there's a lot to say that's beneficial about it outside of it's not as pretty as it would be. But they want to know if we'll just be mulching directly over the leaves. Yeah, I just mulch directly over the leaves. But one thing I'd say about that is make sure your leaves aren't 7 or 8 inches deep. I mean, over the course of the winter, the leaves can be blown about and strewn about, and they may end up some places where they're 6 inches deep. I'm not gonna mulch over that. I would want to go back with a rake and make sure, just in general, that there's not more than a couple inches of leaves anywhere, 3 inches of leaves at this point, and I'll mulch over that. But I wouldn't go in there and add 3 inches of mulch over the top of 8 inches of leaves. So go thin them out, just redistribute them a bit if they've blown into corners. And so that's it. Thank you guys very much for following along with the channel and these question and answer videos. I enjoy them, and I hope you guys, hopefully you get something out of them as well. Thanks for watching.